My name is Mike Giles. I'm very proud and humbled to be standing up here. North Carolina is blessed with scientists that don't have any equal anywhere in the United States. These are nationally known scientists and researchers and educators in their field. And when we were planning this whole event, I started thinking, well, you know, I guess you could call me an environmentalist, so this would be stretching a little bit, call me an environmentalist, so this would be natural for me to moderate this esteemed panel. And one of them is not here. Larry Cahoon called earlier. He had a car problem with his old car, a car problem with his new car. Then I know he rides a motorcycle everywhere he goes, and I said, what about, can you get up here on your scooter? And he said, well, it's supposed to rain, 60% chance of rain in Jacksonville. I don't want to ride through Jacksonville with 10,000 Marines riding around on my motorcycle. So he's not here, we're going to miss him. This panel is all about the environment and what offshore oil and gas exploration could do to our environment. And the guy that announces the boxing on TV, let's get ready to rumble, I could say that right here, because this, to me, is one of the cruxes of the problem. We have, I watched and listened to all of our speakers, Glad talking about she grew up on the Outer Banks, Rudy talking about what is special geologically about North Carolina. Then looking at the maps they showed, North Carolina is sticking out into the ocean. We have one of the most special coasts. Lee Nettles said we have Dare County is the best beach in the world. I think North Carolina has the best coastal system in the world, bar none. And I think it's and that's responsible to a large degree for these gentlemen sitting right up here. So without further ado, we're going to talk about the environmental implications of gas and oil. I'm going to introduce all of them one at a time. They know when they're going to speak. Each one of them is going to get 10 minutes. Then we're going to open it up for public participation, for questions, because I think a lot of you came here to listen to these folks. But to introduce them, to my right is Dr. Pete Peterson. He's a joint distinguished professor at the University of North Carolina Institute of Marine Sciences. He's going to talk about what do we know and data gaps and the way forward to find out that information. Dr. Andy Reed, he's the Stephen A. Tall Professor of Marine Biology at Duke University. He's going to talk about marine mammals, of the Southeast Atlantic. Dr. Doug, I might mispronounce Doug's name, Nowacek, is that close? He's associate professor at Duke University. He's going to talk about seismic surveys and their impacts on marine mammals. Dr. Steve Ross, he's a research professor at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington, UNCW for Marine Sciences, and talk about the fisheries of the Southeast Atlantic. And then Dr. Lynn Piesfischera. I didn't know I knew him as long as I knew him, but we had a long-time friend at NC State University that passed away about 3 or 4 years ago. We bumped in the night at certain events in Raleigh, and he's a professor emeritus at the Department of Marine and Earth Sciences at North Carolina State University. Go Wolfpack. He's going to talk about ocean currents and oil. And Dr. Larry Cahoon, he's a research professor at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. He was going to talk about offshore energy and ecosystem services and whether this potential oil contamination or oil spills or natural gas issues and infrastructure and everything that Dr. Laura Taylor and all the other speakers talked about would reach our coastal system. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Peterson.
Thanks. For a number of us here, this is kind of deja vu. And I thought that I would share with you the process that we underwent about 25 years ago. Okay, I served on something that was called the North Carolina Environmental Science Review Panel. This panel was made up of 5 people. They were chosen by the National Academy of Sciences, by the governor of North Carolina, and by the head of the Secretary, that is, of Interior. The goal was mandated by an act of Congress, and that is to say the Oil Pollution Act. And specifically, this panel was chosen to answer the following questions on the board. The questions were, had sufficient information been gathered about the Mandio prospect that was the one in question at that time that we heard about in the geological sense today? Had sufficient information been collected to allow the Secretary of Interior to move forward to do leasing, to do exploratory drilling, and to do the other activities associated with oil and gas development? And that sufficiency was spelled out in the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, which required that the Secretary have information in 3 areas of investigation: physics and physical oceanography, biology, and socioeconomics. So we had guidance from the National Academy of Sciences report about the nature of what you needed to know and about issues of sufficiency. And we followed the guidance as set by that Academy report beforehand in doing the assessment that we were doing of North Carolina. The reason we were doing this explicitly for North Carolina was that North Carolina had been excluded from an East Coast-wide moratorium against oil and gas development and leasing. And the question was that exclusion appropriate or not? We worried some about the following. At each successive stage in the process of oil and gas development, there are greater risks, and sometimes different risks, to the system. And it would seem appropriate, therefore, that the information we need to know might need to escalate through those stages. At the lease stage, that we didn't have to know quite as much as we needed for the exploratory well stage. We didn't need to know quite as much as we needed for the production stage, and so forth. The difficulty is that as we looked through all of the processes that run through this, all the cases that ran through this process, except at the initial stage, there was never any complete stoppage of the process of oil and gas drilling. So in other words, changes were made at later stages, but only in the beginning could one address whether the sufficiency of the information was adequate to allow the environment to be protected sufficiently during this process. So that made special importance at the level of leasing. So, as I mentioned, there were 3 areas of investigation. Those were physical oceanography, the other was biology and resources of value, and the third, socioeconomics of the communities of people who live in the region and could be expected to be affected by a spill or by the natural processes, which include a lot of sloppiness and a lot of development of infrastructure and other changes to the shoreline in even a successful oil and gas operation. What we determined unanimously as a panel, and we differed dramatically. We had different political views, we had different ages and geographies and the like. We, definitely fought each other about one thing or another. And despite that, we unanimously agreed in none of these areas, physics, biology, or socioeconomics, was there enough known to allow the Secretary to make decisions in the process of oil and gas leasing and development. What I give up here, while I'm talking generically, are some of the specifics where we found need for more knowledge. Interestingly enough, what we did on this panel attracted a lot of attention from the scientific community. So areas where we identified something really and truly neat have actually served to focus various people's research. And the Marine Mammal Group at Duke, focusing on this area that we call the Point, it's north and east of Cape Hatteras, is in particular a recognition that the scientific community has not stood still. Nonetheless, the question still remains whether these areas and these questions are adequately developed in our understanding to allow the Secretary today to allow this process to move forward and to allow oil and gas leasing and the entire process. And I'm not here necessarily to answer that, but as you hear those following me on the podium, you will hear a great deal about how our understanding has developed on some of these key resources. I left over the physical oceanography and the issues, and Len is here to speak to some of that, which is great. But on the physical oceanography, the models of transport of oil on the surface were not sufficient, and the entire models that deal with various filaments, various rings, various eddies that spin off the Gulf Stream were not sufficient to be able to predict with enough accuracy where spilled oil would be transported to. Furthermore, and we learned this in spades from the Deepwater Horizon, the three-dimensional transport in the ocean is not sufficiently known in the area of the Point, in the area of the Mandio Prospect, for us to know interesting things there. And that three-dimensional transport is not an idle concern. We are in an area in North Carolina of interest that is deeper than where the Deepwater Horizon was, an area that has gas hydrates very commonly at the surface, which are explosive. And so issues relating to the safety of a well and blowouts of a well certainly pertain to us and pertain in spades. Physical oceanography. There were many other questions. I give some of these up here and some of the major ones just for you to read while I'm getting my finger exercised, moving to the arrow for the next time. And these are things that were important and are desperately needed and maybe still desperately needed today. In ecology, there were issues of the Point. There were also issues of the Sargassum community. Subsequent to this, a young man from UNCW named Larry Settle did a thesis on the Sargassum community off North Carolina and then went and worked later with NOAA. Whether that's sufficient or not is hard to say, but that was an area of biology that was of great interest. The other area involved deep water invertebrates on the sea floor, deep water corals and other fascinating organisms, including the fishes associated with them, that we recognized not enough knowledge was there to protect these really unique resources. In socioeconomics, the problem and the gaps were worse than they were in either of the other two areas. The socioeconomics were essentially unknown. And the issues here are multitudinous. The issues are how many of the people in the communities, and we think immediately of the Outer Banks, and I think of my friend who preceded me here, the tourism person from Dare County, how many people would be affected? How many jobs? How many issues about public employment and private versus public funding issues come up? We needed that desperately to be able to deal with what people called for previously up here from the podium, weighing the risks against the likely benefits. Quite frankly, without the socioeconomics and this quantitative research that has evolved in socioeconomics, we can't answer that question. So I go on to say that this issue is still before us, and should the Department of Interior and its Secretary wish to move forward, I think that we need to have a deja vu time again, putting these same issues before us, gathering many of the same, quite a few new people together who can comment on this to see if the information is sufficient under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. This isn't imaginary, this is information that's specified. And so the Secretary of Interior needs to have comfort, and that comfort should come from a broad selection of the scientific and management community, not just be done in the dark halls of both. Thanks.
myself in the uncomfortable position of going between Pete Peterson and Doug Nowacek, which is slightly frightening. But it's okay, because I'm Canadian. You now know that we're amongst the nicest people in the world. Perhaps even the nicest people in the world. So I have a difficult job today to talk about marine mammals in the Southeast Atlantic in 10 minutes. I'm also going to throw in a little bit about sea turtles, but I just also want to say at the start, we shouldn't forget the seabirds that live out there, including some endangered seabirds, and especially not forget the human communities that depend on the resources, the offshore resources, some of which I'll be talking about. You heard that from a question today from one of our colleagues in the charter industry. So the map on your left shows the areas that are currently under consideration for seismic exploration in the mid and south Atlantic planning areas. Not all these seismic surveys will occur, but just want to direct your attention to the place where most of those overlap, and that's right off the coast of North Carolina. So from my perspective as a scientist, I want to know, first of all, what's out there in terms of species occurrence. What about the distribution of those species? Where do they occur? Are they all single species, single populations, or is there complex population structure we need to think about? And then something about behavior, so we might know how they would respond to seismic. And then putting all those together, how vulnerable are each of these species when we think about seismic and then down the road possibly thinking about reduction. And in general, let's tell you that following Pete's perspective, we know a little bit about occurrence and distribution. We know virtually nothing about population structure, very little about behavior. So our ability to assess vulnerability is really pretty limited. This map was put together by one of our great MEM master students at Duke, and it's a compilation of survey effort in the area of interest. And all you need to know is that the hot colors are areas where there's been a lot of surveys. We heard this morning from our colleagues from Bowen. They've been funding the AMAP surveys, which are contributing to our knowledge of marine mammals and seabirds and sea turtles in this area. You'll see that there's kind of warm colors around the coast, so we have some pretty good idea about the distribution and occurrence of marine mammals close to shore. Those two hot areas are areas that the Department of Defense, the Navy, has funded intensive surveys that we've led at Duke with our colleagues from UNC Wilmington and other institutions. So in those two little areas, we know quite a lot. As you move outside, especially outside that 50 nautical mile buffer, our knowledge starts to get very incomplete. And as we go outside the exclusive economic zone, as I say here, if anybody tells you that we know anything about there, they're really just making it up. I want to focus your attention on a couple species, but before I go to those, I want to tell you the list of species that's out there. So we know there's a diverse assemblage of species in these offshore waters. 7 species of baleen whales, including this endangered right whale on Mount Cap I'll talk about. 23 species of toothed whales, including these common dolphins. Some of these species of toothed whales are very poorly known. Some of them we have a great deal of time actually identify and telling them apart in the field. And even though I'm not supposed to be talking about sea turtles, I just want to remind you that there are 4 species of sea turtles out there, including loggerheads like this one and the sargassum. And it's important to remember that 10 of these species are listed under the Endangered Species Act as threatened or endangered. And that means that we need to give special consideration to them to make sure that whatever activities are allowed or authorized by the federal government, that those activities don't jeopardize the continued existence and recovery of those listed species. So let's just start with right whales. They're one of the most vulnerable species, one of the species that we're most concerned about. I think most of you know that right whales give birth in the southeastern United States, off the coast of Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. We've had births off Wilmington. And so the moms go south, give birth in coastal waters, and then they migrate north to the feeding grounds in New England and in eastern Canada. We're in Craven County, but in Carter County, the crest of Carter County actually has right whales on it because there was an important right whale fishery off Shackelford Banks. If you've been out to Cape Lookout or you've been downtown Beaufort, you know that whaling, coastal whaling is an important part of our heritage. Right whales are in a very precarious conservation status. Population is so small that we know each individual whale. We know which moms give birth each year. We track the fates of their babies, and we actually track individuals throughout their lifetimes. This month we've already had 3 deaths of right whales, and so including a reproductive active female. So it's a very vulnerable population. The two primary threats to right whales are entanglements in fishing gear, primarily fixed gear like gill nets and crab pots and lobster pots, and ship strikes. We've done a very good job of reducing the incidence of ship strikes with right whales with the ship speed restriction rules that are in place seasonally in the Mid-Atlantic and South Atlantic, but we're still struggling with the entanglement issue. And the point here is that seismic and oil and gas exploration and production are just another stressor that this population will face, and we need to think about that in terms of cumulative impacts of all those stressors as we think about the conservation of this population. Second species I want to focus on is a species you may not have heard about or may not know much about. It's Cuvier's beaked whale. This is a deep diving whale. These are truly remarkable animals. We studied them off Cape Hatteras, off the point of Cape Hatteras. Those of you who are joggers or runners out there, if you've ever run a 5K, these animals run 5K on a single breath. Just imagine that. In the starting line, you take one breath and you run the entire 5 kilometers on that one breath. They dive down to more than 2,800 meters on Cape Hatteras, some animals we tagged, and they stay submerged for periods up to 90 minutes. These are the animals that are particularly susceptible to mid-frequency naval sonar, and we don't know anything about their response to seismic activity, although we're concerned about their vulnerability. The animal on your left there is an animal we know very well. We've tagged it twice and collected a biopsy sample of it from male. And the plot on your right just shows the movements of that animal together with 5 other Cuvier's beaked whales off the point of Cape Hatteras. My point here is just to show you that those animals call that place home. So even though we think of Cuvier's beaked whales as being widely distributed in the Atlantic, these particular animals, including this individual, calls that place home. We don't know what the effects of displacing it would be because it's learned to live and make a living in that one particular area. The species that Boehm predicts will be most affected by seismic activities of the Gulf as well. You can see the numbers here from Dr. Bill Brown talking about the programmatic EIS. Now we know these numbers are conservative and that they're larger than
a particular part of the ocean that transduces sound very well. But all those red dots are places all over the world where that sound is heard. Right? It didn't actually follow those blue little lines that are on there, which somebody asked me once, which is a good question. But low frequencies, which are in the same range that the seismic air guns produce, travel extremely well through the ocean. And that's the quick acoustic lesson for today. So we know the noise travels well. The next question is, does noise impact wild animals? And I think it's probably worth just thinking for a second about noise impacts on humans. We've known for a long time that noise causes stress. I mean, in fact, we don't have any federal legislation that governs the amount of light that can be in your workplace or the amount of smell that can be in your workplace. But we sure have regulations on the amount of noise that can be in your workplace because it causes stress, fatigue, and all these things. And so, but the question is, does it impact wild animals? And just recently, we benefited from some great work out of a group in Colorado that reviewed the synthesis of that came on the screen, 20 years documenting the effects of noise on wildlife. And this primarily, there were about 300 studies reviewed, and 2/3 of them were on birds and marine mammals. And among other things, what some of their main conclusions, a majority of the studies, and I've highlighted that because again, there are some that find both ways, documented effects of noise, including all these things you see, but very importantly at the end, it says individual fitness and the structure of ecological communities. And so the science has progressed to the point where we can actually start to ask some of those questions and get some at least preliminary answers. But the fact that we have measured consequences for individual fitness, that means the success of an animal in surviving and reproducing is impacted by noise, is a very important point. Okay, so what does an air gun sound like? There are not very many varieties of air guns out there. What you see on the left is one of the vessels that does this. On the right is the actual air gun itself, which is about like that. And these things, the ship sends a highly compressed air down to these guns, and they release it electronically timed, and there may be anywhere from 20 to 30 air guns in an array. And they're timed to go off such that they produce a single pulse of sound when they get in a little bit away from the array. And that pulse of sound travels down, as you heard a little bit this morning, through the water, into the substructure. It bounces off all those various features in there. In our physics lesson from this morning, the different densities of those things, like rock, oil, water, gas, causes differences in the way that sound refracts back up into the water. So I wanted to play it for you, and I'll talk you through this. The thing you're looking at the bottom is a spectrogram in time across the x-axis and frequency on the y. And one thing to note is that where it's very red at the bottom is the area where most of the energy is concentrated. It's also where all of those big whales that, or the big whales that Andy mentioned, right whales and others, hear very well. All right, let's see that. So there it is. Yeah, turn it on. Play again. So there are a couple things that I want to point out. Let's see if I play this again. That's great. So the little pings that you see on there are actually depth sensors. So those are incredibly clever and prevalent in the ocean, which is another whole discussion. Oh, wait, that's fine. You get the idea of that. But it reverberates, right? It's not just a quick pulse. And you can see the energy trail out well after the pulse goes off. And in these seismic surveys, great things, these pulses go off every 10 seconds or so, 24/7, and sometimes for weeks or months on end. It's what it takes to cover one of these survey areas. Here's a little graphic that came from Chris Clark's lab at Cornell, which is very helpful. So this is off the mountain of Chesapeake. And what you see is the area where the vessel is about 60 miles offshore. The pulse rings are 10 seconds apart. And then there's two whales out there. And what's important to note, a couple things, is that we can argue about modeling sound propagation as it goes toward shore. This is one of those fun things that we nerds like to argue about. But anyway, those animals are being affected every 10 seconds by the actual pulse, or receiving that pulse, I should say. But also in between, if you look out in the areas where you still see the ambient with the dark blue, is the noise levels elevated in between the pulses. And it's elevated to levels on this kind of scale that actually has been shown to have impacts, measurable impacts on bowhead whales. Bowheads are a very close cousin to right whales. So that's an important piece. This is just another way to look at that graph, and I won't spend too much time on it. It's that same area, the whales and those two lollipops there. And across the bottom, what you see is the amount of energy received at those two locations. The yellow one being the closer one, the orange one farther away. And this is a great segue from one of the things that Pete said, and Andy reiterated. We have developed tools that we can actually ask some of these questions. But this is one of the main places where I feel that the EIS that's prepared for the G&G really falls down, because they did not consider any impacts beyond the first 500 meters, really, of area around the site of the survey vessel. And just to put a fine point on it, this is some data, actual data, so I'm not just making it all up. Quickly, this is a bunch of seismic survey pulses. What you see at the very top, the little cross hatches, are the actual pulses. We have sound amplitude on the y-axis. But what we see in those fuzzy traces, dark blue is 2.5 to 5 seconds. The lighter blue that's behind it is 5 to 7.5. And the orange is 7.5 to 10 seconds after the impulse arrives. And so what happens is we're seeing this elevation in the background noise level. The ambient noise level, or the level at which the animals are used to communicating, occurs at that red line. So what we're doing